She laughed so hard wine nearly shot out her nose. At a five-star restaurant, where crystal chandeliers gleamed and forks cost more than most people's rent, Eleanor Grayson was mocking a waiter for mispronouncing coco vin. "You'd think they'd hire people who can at least speak the menu," she sneered, her voice slicing through the hum of polite conversation. Her dinner companions, Mark, her husband, and Clara. Her old college friend shifted uncomfortably, but Eleanor didn't notice. She was too busy reveling in her own wit, her manicured nails tapping the linen tablecloth as she gestured at the waiter, a young man named Amir, whose face burned red under her gaze. His accent, thick with traces of somewhere far from this polished dining room, had betrayed him. Amir stood frozen, tray in hand, his dark eyes locked on the floor. The restaurant's warm light caught the sweat beading on his forehead. He murmured an apology, his voice barely audible, and moved to clear the plates. Eleanor's laughter followed him like a shadow. Mark cleared his throat. Maybe he's up," he said, his tone low but firm. He glanced at Amir's retreating figure, then back at his wife, whose smirk didn't waver. "Oh, come on, Mark. It's just a joke. If he can't handle it, maybe he shouldn't be serving people like us." Her words dripped with entitlement, the kind that came from a lifetime of getting exactly what she wanted. Clara, sipping her wine, said nothing, but her lips pressed into a thin line. The night was supposed to be a celebration. Eleanor had just closed a major deal at her law firm, a multimillion-dollar contract that would cement her as a partner. Mark, a cardiologist, had insisted on dining at Lucille, the city's most exclusive restaurant, to mark the occasion. Clara, visiting from out of town, had tagged along, though her quiet demeanor suggested she was already regretting it. As Amir returned with their entrees, Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Let's hope you don't drop these," she said, her voice loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables. A few patrons glanced over, then quickly looked away, unwilling to get involved. Amir's hands trembled slightly as he set the plates down, but he said nothing, his jaw tight. Clara finally spoke, her voice soft but cutting. "Eleanor, that's enough." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, surprised but undeterred. "Oh, Clara, don't be so sensitive. It's not like he's curing cancer. He's just a waiter." The word just hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Amir's shoulders stiffened, but he turned and walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. Mark's face darkened, his fork clattering against his plate. "You're being unfair," he said. "He's doing his job." "Unfair," Eleanor scoffed, tossing her hair. "I'm paying for perfection, Mark. If I wanted broken English, I'd eat at a food truck." The table fell silent. Clara stared at her plate, her knuckles white around her glass. Mark's jaw worked, but he didn't respond. The tension was palpable, a storm brewing in the space between them. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, the restaurant's walls told a different story. Beyond the polished tables and velvet curtains, a mahogany donor wall gleamed in the lobby, etched with names of those who'd contributed to the hospital foundation that owned Lucille. It was a quiet tribute, one most diners passed without a second glance. But tonight it would change everything. As the meal progressed, Eleanor's barbs didn't stop. She mocked Amir's every move, his careful steps, the way he refilled their water glasses with precision, even the polite smile he forced despite her cruelty. Each comment was a dart, and though Amir didn't flinch again, his eyes grew darker, his movements more deliberate. Clara, usually the peacemaker, couldn't hold back any longer. "Why do you do this, Elle?" she asked, her voice trembling with frustration. "What's the point of humiliating him?" Eleanor rolled her eyes. "It's not humiliation. It's holding people to a standard. You think I got where I am by accepting mediocrity. Mediocrity, Clara snapped, her voice rising. He's serving you food, not drafting your contracts. What's wrong with you? Mark leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. She's right, Elle. You're crossing a line. Eleanor's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Oh, please. You're both acting like I'm some villain. He's fine. People like him are used to this. The words landed like a slap. Clara's face flushed, and Mark's eyes widened. People like him? He repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. What's that supposed to mean? Eleanor shrugged, unfazed. You know what I mean. Immigrants, people who don't belong in places like this. They're here to serve, not to be coddled. The table went deathly silent. A few nearby diners turned, their whispers filling the air. Amir, who'd been approaching with a dessert menu, froze mid-step, his face unreadable. He'd heard every word. Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need some air, she said, her voice shaking. She grabbed her purse and strode toward the lobby, her heels clicking sharply. Mark hesitated, then followed, throwing Eleanor a look that was equal parts anger and disbelief. Eleanor sat alone, her expression defiant but her hands fidgeting with her napkin. She sipped her wine, trying to shake off the unease creeping into her chest. She told herself she was right, that she was just being honest. But the silence at the table felt heavier than she'd expected. In the lobby, Clara stood before the donor wall, her arms crossed tightly. Mark joined her, his face still stormy. She's out of control, he muttered. Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the wall. She's always been like this, Mark. She thinks she's above everyone. But this she trailed off, her gaze catching on something. Her breath hitched. What? Mark asked, following her line of sight. Clara pointed to the wall, where names were etched in elegant gold script. One name stood out, bold and unmistakable. Amir Hosseini. Below it, in smaller text, were the words, in recognition of life-saving contributions to the Children's Hospital Foundation. Mark's mouth fell open. That's him. Clara nodded, her eyes wide. He's not just a waiter. They stood there, staring at the name, the weight of it sinking in. Amir, the man Eleanor had spent the evening mocking, wasn't just serving tables. He was a hero, someone who'd given enough to earn a permanent place on this walla wall that represented sacrifice, compassion, and humanity. Back at the table, Eleanor was oblivious, still sipping her wine, still convinced she was untouchable. But the air in the restaurant had shifted. Other diners were whispering now, their glances darting between her and the kitchen door where Amir had disappeared. Clara and Mark returned, their faces grim. Eleanor, Clara said, her voice low but steady. You need to see something. Eleanor frowned, setting down her glass. What now? Another lecture. Mark didn't answer. He just gestured toward the lobby. Come with us. Reluctantly, Eleanor stood, smoothing her dress. She followed them, her heels clicking with the same confidence she'd carried all night. But as they approached the donor wall, her steps slowed. Clara pointed to Amir's name, and Eleanor's eyes followed. She froze, her face drained of color, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. The name Amir Hosseini stared back at her, a silent accusation. The text beneath it blurred in her vision, but the words life-saving contributions burned into her mind. That's him? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Clara nodded, her expression hard. The man you've been humiliating all night? He saved lives. What have you done, Eleanor, besides tear people down? Eleanor's knees wobbled, and she gripped the edge of a nearby table for support. The weight of her words, her actions, crashed over her like a tidal wave. She'd mocked him, belittled him, reduced him to nothing because of his accent, his job, his existence. And now, standing before this wall, she saw the truth. Amir was more than she'd ever given him credit for. Mark's voice was quiet but firm. "You owe him an apology." Eleanor shook her head, not in refusal but in disbelief. I didn't know." "You didn't care to know," Clara snapped. "You saw what you wanted to see." The lobby felt suffocating now, the chandeliers too bright, the murmurs of other diners too loud. Eleanor's mind raced, replaying every cruel word she'd thrown at Amir. She wanted to run, to hide, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Amir emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of drinks for another table. He didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge the scene unfolding in the lobby. But as he passed, his eyes met Eleanor's for a fleeting moment. There was no anger there, no resentment, just a quiet dignity that made her feel smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. Amir moved on, serving his table with the same care and precision he'd shown all night. Clara turned to Eleanor, her voice softer now but no less piercing. "You can't undo what you said, but you can do better. The question is, will you?" Eleanor didn't answer. She couldn't. The donor wall loomed behind her, a testament to the man she dismissed, a mirror reflecting the ugliness of her own prejudice. For the first time in years, Eleanor Grayson, successful, confident, untouchable, felt utterly exposed. Eleanor stood motionless before the donor wall, the golden letters of Amir Hosseini's name searing into her consciousness. The restaurant's ambient hum, clinking glasses, murmured conversations. The soft jazz from hidden speakers faded into a distant buzz. Her heart pounded, each beat a reminder of her cruelty. She wanted to disappear, to rewind the night, to erase the venom she'd spewed so carelessly. But the truth stood before her, unyielding, etched in gold. Clara's words echoed in her mind. You saw what you wanted to see. They stung because they were true. Eleanor had built her life on snap judgments, on the belief that her success, her status, gave her the right to look down on others. Amir's accent, his job, his quiet demeanor, she'd used them as weapons, assuming they defined him. Now the donor wall mocked her arrogance, revealing a man whose impact far outweighed her own. Mark touched her arm, his voice low. We need to go back to the table. People are staring." She nodded mechanically, her legs moving as if on autopilot. As they returned to their seats, the other diners' glances felt like pinpricks. Eleanor kept her eyes down, avoiding the faces around her, especially Amir's. He was serving another table now, his movements steady, his expression calm. How did he do it? How did he carry himself with such grace after her relentless attacks? Clara sat down, her posture rigid. "You need to say something to him," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Not for him, for you." Eleanor's throat tightened. What could I possibly say? Sorry I mocked your existence? Her voice cracked, a rare glimpse of vulnerability breaking through her polished exterior. Mark leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "Start with the truth. You were wrong. Own it." The idea of apologizing felt foreign, almost impossible. Eleanor Grayson didn't apologize, not to waiters, not to anyone. She'd spent years climbing the corporate ladder, sharpening her edges, learning to never show weakness. But now, sitting in this gilded restaurant, surrounded by people who'd witnessed her cruelty, she felt like a child caught in a lie. Amir approached their table again, this time with the bill. His face was neutral, professional, but Eleanor noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the leather folder a little too tightly. She wondered how many times he'd endured nights like this, How many people had dismissed him because of his accent or his job? The thought made her stomach churn. "Thank you," she murmured as he set the folder down, her voice barely audible. It wasn't enough, not even close, but it was all she could manage. Amir nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a split second before he turned away. There was no forgiveness in his gaze, no warmth, just a quiet acknowledgement that he'd heard her. It felt worse than if he'd glared at her. As he walked away, Clara leaned in. "That's not an apology, Elle. You know that." Eleanor's hands shook as she opened the bill folder. Inside, the total was neatly printed, but her eyes blurred, unable to focus. She felt Mark and Clara watching her, waiting for her to do something, anything to make this right. But what could she do? The damage was done, her words hanging in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. The rest of the meal passed in a haze. Eleanor barely touched her dessert, the chocolate torte turning to ash in her mouth. Clara and Mark made small talk, trying to salvage the evening, but the tension was unbreakable. Every time Amir passed their table, Eleanor's chest tightened, her mind replaying her earlier words. People like him, they're here to serve. She wanted to scream at her past self, to shake the woman who'd said those things without a second thought. When they finally stood to leave, Eleanor's legs felt heavy, as if the weight of the night had settled into her bones. She lagged behind Mark and Clara as they headed toward the exit, her eyes drawn back to the donor wall. She stopped, staring at Amir's name again, the words life-saving contributions burning brighter than before. "Do you know what he did?" she asked a passing hostess, her voice trembling. "For the hospital, I mean." The hostess, a young woman with a kind smile, nodded. "Amir? Oh, he's incredible. He donated half his savings to the children's wing a few years ago. Helped fund a new ICU for kids with cancer. He volunteers there too when he's not working here." Eleanor's breath caught. She pictured Amir in this very restaurant, serving people like her night after night, then spending his days off with sick children, giving more than she ever had. The contrast was unbearable. Mark called her name from the doorway, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Not yet. She turned back toward the dining room, where Amir was clearing a table, his movements as precise as ever. Before she could think better of it, she walked toward him, her heart racing. "Amir," she said, her voice louder than she'd intended. He looked up, surprised, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. I owe you an apology," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "What I said tonight, what I did, it was wrong. I was cruel and I'm sorry. I didn't know," she gestured vaguely toward the donor wall, her voice breaking. "I didn't know who you are." Amir's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened slightly, as if weighing her words. "You didn't need to know," he said quietly. "I'm just a person, like you." The simplicity of his response hit her harder than any rebuke could have. He didn't lash out, didn't demand more. He just stood there, holding her gaze, letting her sit with the weight of her actions. "I'm trying to do better," she whispered, unsure if she was saying it to him or to herself. He nodded just once, then returned to his work. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was enough to let her walk away. Outside, the night air was cool, a sharp contrast to the stifling warmth of the restaurant. Clara and Mark were waiting by the car, their faces a mix of relief and wariness. Eleanor didn't speak as they drove home, her mind a tangle of shame and resolve. She'd always prided herself on being in control, on knowing exactly who she was. But tonight, she'd seen a version of herself she didn't recognize, a version she never wanted to see again. The next morning, Eleanor woke early, her dreams haunted by Amir's face, the donor wall, the sound of her own laughter. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at her coffee, and made a decision. She opened her laptop and searched for the Children's Hospital Foundation. The website was bright and welcoming, filled with stories of patients, volunteers, and donors. There, in a small feature article, was Amir's name, alongside a photo of him reading to a group of kids in hospital gowns. The caption read, "Amir Hosseini, a local hero whose generosity has given hope to countless families." Eleanor clicked the donate button before she could second-guess herself. She didn't have Amir's selflessness, not yet, but she could start somewhere. She pledged a sum that made her hands tremble, not because it would bankrupt her, but because it was the first time she'd given without expecting something in return. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor couldn't shake the night at Lucille. She started noticing things she'd ignored before: the way her colleagues dismissed assistants, the casual stereotypes tossed around in boardroom banter, the assumptions she'd made about people based on their clothes, their accents, their jobs. Each realization was a small cut, a reminder of how blind she'd been. She returned to the restaurant once, alone, hoping to see Amir. She wanted to thank him, not just for accepting her apology, but for showing her a better way to be. But he wasn't there. The same hostess from before smiled sadly when Eleanor asked about him. "He's on leave," she said, "volunteering overseas for a few months. Some medical outreach program in his home country." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Of course he was. She left a note for him with the hostess, a simple card that read, "Thank you for teaching me what matters." She didn't sign it. He'd know who it was from. Back at work, Eleanor started small changes. She listened more, judged less. She mentored a young intern from a background she'd once dismissed, surprised by the woman's brilliance. She spoke up when a colleague made a snide remark about outsiders in a meeting, her voice steady despite the room's stunned silence. It wasn't easy. Old habits died hard, but each step felt like a brick in a new foundation. Clara noticed the change when they met for coffee months later. "You're different," she said, stirring her latte. "Not perfect, but trying." Eleanor smiled, a little sadly. "I have a lot to make up for." Mark, too, saw the shift. He'd been distant since that night, but slowly they started talking again, not just about work or schedules, but about who they wanted to be. One evening, he brought home a flyer for a hospital fundraiser. "Thought we could go," he said. "Maybe do some good." They went. The event was crowded, filled with doctors, donors, and families whose lives had been touched by the hospital. Eleanor scanned the room, half hoping to see Amir, but he wasn't there. Instead, she met a mother whose daughter had been treated in the ICU Amir helped fund. The woman's gratitude, her tears as she spoke of her child's recovery, hit Eleanor like a wave. She realized then that Amir's impact rippled far beyond that donor wall. As the fundraiser ended, Eleanor stood at the edge of the room, watching people laugh and connect. She felt a quiet peace, not because she'd erased her mistakes, but because she was finally moving forward. She'd been given a chance to see the world differently, to see people differently, and she wasn't going to waste it. The story of that night at Lucille stayed with her, a reminder of how quickly prejudice could blind someone and how powerfully truth could open their eyes. It wasn't just about Amir or the donor wall. It was about the countless others she'd judged without knowing, the stories she'd never bothered to learn. What do you think? Can one moment of reckoning change a person's heart? Or do some biases run too deep, even when faced with undeniable truth? Share your thoughts on where justice lies in this clash of pride and redemption.